Hey, welcome to another exciting edition of the Standing for Freedom podcast, where we defend life, liberty, and truth for the next generation. And I'm joined today by Michael Knowles, host of The Michael Knowles Show, and author of the most recent book, Speechless: Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. Michael, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Well, we're honored, and I know there's a lot to talk about. Real quick, personal note, you're a dad.
Yes.
Talk about that.
So it actually relates to the book.
Okay.
By an act of providence
Yeah.
or cosmic sadism, my book and my baby were due into the world on the same day, on January 18th.
Okay.
And the nurses must have thought that I was the most callous sociopath on earth, because I'm sitting there in the delivery room, my poor wife screaming, shrieking, and I'm finishing up my notes, and I'm formatting the little end notes or whatever. They both were delivered on time. Yeah. My son did not give me one day's rest. But there was an amazing thing, which is I put my heart and soul into this book. My first book didn't have any words in it. This book has quite a few words in it. And I think it's an idea that has not really been expressed on the right. I think it's an urgent idea for what we're looking at. And then the baby comes out. Yeah. And I think, oh, who cares? Who cares about that? I mean, I think compared to other books, I think it's a pretty good book. But I got this baby here. I got a living human being. You know, it's really puts things in perspective.
Makes you a good father and an excellent husband, by the way, because I'm sure your wife appreciated that.
Yes.
Like, don't stress about this. Let's just focus on the family. That's great. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, talk a little bit about, first of all, just give me the contours. What's this really about, and why did you write it?
So I wrote it because political correctness has been with us, at least in the public conscience, for about 30 years. Yeah. I had a feeling it probably went a little further back than that. We've been fighting against it for my whole life. Right. I've been hearing conservatives railing against political correctness. Now it's called wokeness or cancel culture. It's all the same thing. Right. Donald Trump says in his 2016 campaign, this is a campaign about immigration, very important issue, about judges, very important issue, about life, an important issue. And yet he said, the greatest danger to the country is political correctness. Wow, this has got to be a pretty bad thing. Well, what is it? As I understand it, after reading many other books with words and watching many other of these activists, political correctness is a purely negative campaign. It doesn't offer anything edifying. It's purely negative. The sole purpose is to destroy the traditional culture and the traditional standards. It comes, I believe, from a line from Karl Marx, who called for the ruthless criticism of all that exists. And from that you get academic movements like critical theory, critical race theory, deconstruction, right? All these things just tear stuff down. Right. And I think this is why we lose, because we don't quite get what it is and we don't know how to push back. So I think there are two ways that for the past 30, 40 years conservatives have been fighting against political correctness. And I think both ways help advance political correctness. The first one is the squishes. What do the squishes do? They give in. Yeah. They surrender. You want me to call Caitlyn Jenner a she? Okay. Right. You want me to give up on marriage? Okay. You want me to give up on life? Oh, fine. No, but whatever you want. Right. You do you. Okay. But the you do you relates to the other group of conservatives. They're the stalwart ones. They're the ones who say, I'm not calling Bruce Jenner a she. I'm not giving up on this issue. I'm not going to say what you want me to say. I'm a free speech absolutist, you'll hear some of them say. I think you should be able to say whatever you want to say at any given time. You ought to be able to do whatever you want to do in the privacy of your own home. Just don't make me pay for it. That sort of. You see, the problem here is the one group gives in to the left's crazy new standards. Yeah. The other group gives up standards entirely. Either way, no one is left defending the traditional standards. And so what happens? Nature abhors a vacuum, and the new crazy standard of political correctness takes its place. So no matter how hard we fight back, sometimes with that latter group, they're fighting back until they're blue in the face. But no matter how hard we fight back, we keep losing ground.
So culture wars, where obviously you're seeing conservatives lose major ground in significant areas, marriage, sexuality, right? There's a fight currently over education. Yep. You're seeing the parents push back. So kind of getting into that a little bit more. I think historically back in the 1980s, Larry Flint had this case, and it was a defense of free speech. And he took the argument that many so-called conservatives today are now taking, which is to say that there is no, and you call for a just and prudent way of maybe
of censorship.
Of censorship.
I'm calling for. I know it's controversial. I'm not allowed to say this.
That's right.
Conservatives need just and prudent censorship.
Jerry Falwell Sr., the founder of Liberty University, that's exactly the argument that he made in the 1980s, arguing from a classic, traditional, conservative position. You know, talk a little bit about that. What does that actually mean?
It means that we've lost our minds. You know, Reagan had a good line. He said that our opponents, it's not so much what they don't know, but what they know for certain that just ain't so that gets everybody in trouble. And I think that's true of conservatives today. You mentioned Larry Flynt. Larry Flynt was making ridiculous arguments, such as that we have a First Amendment right to pornography. Right. There is no such thing. We have had laws against obscenity for the entire history of our country. Just as recently as 2009, the federal government imprisoned a pornographer for almost 4 years for obscenity. It wasn't any other crime. It wasn't child porn. It wasn't rape on set. It was just obscenity, and he should have been imprisoned. That was the right call. There have always been these regulations. Now we pretend there's a First Amendment protection against it. You see it on something like academic freedom. William F. Buckley Jr., a guy who launches the post-war conservative movement, as mainstream a conservative as ever there was. His first book was called God and Man at Yale.
You went to Yale.
I went to Yale, too.
Okay, there you go.
I was the one, there were about 7 conservatives out of Yale. Buckley was one, I was one. The subtitle of that book was The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. He put it in quotes. He called academic freedom a hoax. He said that this is just a tool for the left to tear down traditional standards. He said the Yale Department of Sociology would never hire a neo-Nazi to proclaim about the superiority of the Aryan man, nor should it. Obviously, the university has standards, it has a mission. That's not going to go along with it, so they're going to boot him out of the classroom. And yet, when the leftist radicals want to push critical race theory, for instance, actually another race theory, we are told we must tolerate this in the name of academic freedom. You saw it most clearly, I guess, with the free speech movement at Berkeley. You know, in Berkeley in the 1960s, you have the free speech movement. And a few years ago, when the leftist Antifa people were terrorizing Ben Shapiro and Ann Coulter and any conservative who would go to campus, people marveled. They said, oh my gosh, Berkeley was the home of the free speech movement, but now they're anti-free speech. It's because it was always a farce. It was political correctness is not a battle between free speech and censorship, as some misguided conservatives seem to believe today. It is a battle between two sets of standards. Society will always have taboos. Certain things will always be off limits. There will always be a cancel culture. There must be. That's how society functions. In the 1950s, we canceled communists. Today, we cancel anti-communists. The issue is not that we cancel or ostracize or censor. The issue is, what do we ostracize? What do we censor? In the past, we had standards of justice. We had standards of goodness, truth, and beauty, right? Today, it's quite the opposite of that. And I think the left understands it. They understand free speech much better than we do. And conservatives will either wise up and find the courage, which is not just a virtue, but the prerequisite of all the other virtues. They will find the courage to enforce standards, or they'll continue to lose. The choice is yours. That's your freedom. Your choice is yours.
Okay, so what is ultimately the answer? I mean, in terms of, obviously the libertarian argument doesn't ultimately win, right? Because that surrenders ground, you do you.
And I'd like to pause you there for a second, because I want to be fair to the libertarians.
Sure.
I think there are a lot of people today who use the term libertarian. Maybe often they're sort of neoconservatives, or the you do you types today.
Sure.
Really do not do justice to the classical liberals of the past. John Locke is the father of liberalism. It's about as classical a liberal as they get. In his letter concerning toleration, he says we need to censor atheists. He says the political order could not tolerate that. It would undermine the political order on which the tolerance rests. John Milton wrote Areopagitica, it's the most famous defense of free speech in the English language. And he says, we have to tolerate everybody, free speech for everybody, except Catholics. Now, look, I'm glad that they don't censor Catholics anymore. This book wouldn't exist.
Right.
But he made, I think, an important point. He's in the midst of massive religious strife tearing the country apart, and he's saying this regime cannot tolerate that particular kind of dissent, or the whole thing will collapse and there will be no such thing as free speech. Even the classical liberals understood that there are limits. That's the way language is. If a word means one thing, it doesn't mean another thing. There are always constraints. And so today, the people who might call themselves libertarian, or I don't know what true conservatives with a capital T and a capital C and a trademark over the S, they pretend you do you, that's some sort of long academic and intellectual pedigree. I think they're full of it.
Yeah, it's not tested. I mean, it's one of those things where it becomes a trope. You say it, it's easy to repeat, but people are not thinking through what are the consequences, what are the costs of taking this position. 20 years ago, terrorism was something overseas. Yeah. Right? It's something you go and fight. We have to go and find these terror grounds, right? George W. Bush, I mean, that was one of the things in the Bush doctrine. You're going to have to root out those things that are an enemy of the West. What we're seeing now with education is the training grounds are everywhere. Yeah. It's K through 12 education. It's on college campuses. There's Confucius Institutes being built in the U.S. So this stuff is everywhere. How should conservatives now fortify themselves? Okay, there's that defensive posture, but then also go on offense to gain back some of the ground that's been lost.
You ever hear this phrase? We shouldn't teach students what to think, only how to think. This is such a popular phrase.
Oh, sure.
I hear it not just on the left, I hear it on the right.
Yeah, what about catechism?
Yes,
right?
Right. Well, what about, the other way they put it? They'll say, we should educate, not indoctrinate. Now, look, I'm no etymologist. Yeah. However, it seems to me those two words mean exactly the same thing.
Sure.
It's just one has a positive connotation, one has a negative one. The fact is, education is coercive. Yeah. When you tell a student that 2 + 2 = 4, you're telling him 2 + 2 does not equal 5. If the student writes down 5 as the answer to that question, they will be punished. Right. They'll get a bad grade because it doesn't just hold for mathematics. History. If some student is answering a question on his test, he said the American Civil War began in 1622. He will be punished for that.
But wait, it could happen.
But I know, these days, right, it's all words, words, words.
Sure.
There is objective reality, and we need to teach that sort of thing. It's not just all a social construction, as the left seems to believe. The left seems to believe that the way that they can control politics is through tyranny of will. Reminds me of Humpty Dumpty in Through the Looking Glass. Humpty Dumpty says that in his language, words mean whatever he wants them to mean. And Alice says, well, can words really mean all those different things? And he says, the real question is, which is to be master? That's all, right? That's the Humpty Dumpty view is the left-wing view. Words can mean whatever we want them to mean. The right-wing view is different than that. The right-wing view is that there is objective reality. Words are signs that correspond to reality. But what the left understands that the right doesn't is that you then need to use your will in conjunction with your intellect to enforce this idea, to teach, to instruct, to embrace standards. The right doesn't want to do that because we're stuck in this idiotic sort of you do you, as you put it, mentality, which is not only shallow, but it undermines the very point they're making. Here would be an example of it. It gets down to a misunderstanding of what liberty is, right? The conservative understanding of liberty, the traditional one, is liberty is not the freedom to do whatever you want at any given time. It's the right to do what you ought to do. The modern liberal idea is it's just you do you. So a heroin addict. Is a heroin addict free or not free? A heroin addict who gets his junk. Is he free or is he a slave? The modern liberal view says as long as he's got a couple bucks in his pocket, he can shoot up, he's the freest man in the world. How dare you have a law to prevent him from shooting up that heroin? That's what he wants to do. It's his freedom, right? And we know he's a slave. He's a slave to his base passions. St. Paul says, the things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do. Yeah. What he's describing is there's a lower will, that's our appetite, and then there's a higher will that we can discipline. We formerly did this through liberal education, the liberal arts, to make sense of your liberty. And that higher will is the mediator between the divine will and your base animal passions. We once understood that. We don't understand that anymore. That higher will requires limits. It requires discipline. It requires the cultivation of virtue. And you ain't going to get that in a nation of heroin addicts.
No, absolutely not. I want to there's so much I could talk about, and I know your time is limited, but what I do want to talk about is where you see the conservative movement going. Obviously, Trump is not president, right? But it seems as though Trumpism is around, or maybe another way to call it is populism.
Yeah.
Do you see the future of the conservative movement being one of pluralism or one of populism?
I think it will be. I mean, I don't really see those two at odds necessarily, pluralism and populism. But I see the point that you're making. There's this kind of last 20 years of conservatism which says you can say anything, believe anything, do anything, but we've got a big tent. As long as you want to cut taxes, you're a conservative. We got, Democrats are the real transphobes. We're the biggest right. Okay, that's that ain't the future.
Yeah.
And I travel to a lot of college campuses, a lot of students, you see them on campus, and that's not what I see as the future. I hear that when I do hear that, it's usually from boomer types who have lost the thread. But the insightful boomers and millennials, and especially Gen Z, recognize, no, we want truth. We want orthodoxy. It's this idea that you see in religion a lot. When churches want to attract the youths, what do? They start compromising their doctrine. They start destroying any sort of liturgy they have. They just try to meet the youths in worldliness. And nobody wants that. I'll tell you this from a Catholic perspective. You go to the parishes that are really hip and modern and compromise on doctrine, and it's all 80-year-old women. It's all no kids anywhere to be seen. Do you know where the kids are? They're at Latin Mass with a serious liturgy and with serious doctrine.
Because of the transcendence element.
Yes.
Yeah, they want to tap into a tradition that is beyond. Yeah, right.
The way I see it in a very simple way is you've got the yes, yes, yes conservatives. The conservatives who all they can say is yes. Oh, yeah, you think we should have critical race theory in schools? Yes. We'll have other stuff, but yes, of course. Let's expand. Let's be open. Let's be inclusive. A man can be a woman? Sure, that's fine, as long as, yes, yes, yes. But there's a magical little word. It's a 2-letter word. No. No is good. Just like in a sonnet, the limits permit the beauty and they permit the flourishing. And I think if there is to be a future of the conservative movement, we need to be willing to say, no, this is beyond bounds. We stand for something. What is the only issue that we have made any ground whatsoever on over the past 40 years? I think the only issue we've made any ground on, I mean, I'm not talking about taxes or whatever.
Right.
They cut that and then they raise it and they cut it and they raise it. Abortion. Abortion is the one issue where, at the very least, we haven't lost ground, and in a lot of states we've actually gained ground. Why? It's the only issue that we undertake by making arguments from justice. I'm not the first person to observe this.
Let's talk about that, justice.
Justice.
Why is that important?
Well, to quote James Madison, justice is the end of government. It always has been and always will be until liberty be lost in the pursuit. Our Constitution promises us, or it says that it exists, to give us the blessings of liberty. We seem to have made an idol, though, and a distortion and a perversion out of liberty. We now believe that liberty is the same thing as licentiousness. Which the Founding Fathers were very clear is not the case,
right.
quite opposites. We seem to believe that the purpose of government is to allow me, the radical autonomous individual, to do whatever I want at any given time. That is an insane idea. It's nothing conservative about it, nothing American about it. Justice is the end of government. And oh, do you hear this other? Oh gosh, we could spend several hours just talking about all the stupid slogans that people say.
Sure.
Have you ever heard this one? You'll hear people say, "You can't legislate morality."
Oh, yeah, it's called the Constitution. We've already done this, right?
It's called every law.
Yeah, every law that we've ever done imaginable assumes, right,
yes.
Truth, morality, everything is in there.
All laws are referring ultimately to the moral law. You could be talking about capital punishment. You could be talking about parking tickets. Right? You're making some kind of moral claim, and so you start to win a little bit on abortion because that stirs men's souls. We have a conscience, even if our conscience has been clouded and compromised by sin, both in society and at the individual level. Even amid that, our conscience still is stirring within us. We can recognize that justice. Or you can make these utilitarian arguments. We've got to trim the Medicare program a little bit and make it work a little, and the Social Security. We don't need to change anything about society. We just need to go in and manage it a little bit better. That has been the argument that conservatives have made on every other issue, just about, other than abortion.
I call it finessing the problem.
Finessing yes, it is. Giving a little massage to this really wicked thing. No surprise, we haven't won very much on those fronts.
A final question. I'm going to ask you this: when it comes to a worldview, everybody today, postmodernists, all of that, there is no truth, there is no meta-narrative, all of that's gone. What is the most essential when it comes to a worldview? And you might say theology, you might say an understanding of, obviously, everything begins with God, right? Yeah. The most important words in all the Bible is in the beginning, God, right? Yeah. Everything else flows from that. It's revelatory. But I want to hear from you just how you think about it, how you frame out your worldview, how it informs and makes you, I almost like puts things in order, right? There could be chaos, but for you, you understand, hey, look, there is truth, even in the midst of this chaos here that I'm seeing.
If you asked me what I believe, I would have to say, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, if you're right. And you know the rest of the creed.
Yeah.
Yes, that is what I believe. It's the creed, right? Yeah. Now, I say that not only because I believe it, but because it's shocking to a great many people. They will say, Michael, that's your religion. They used to say you had freedom of religion. Now they say freedom of worship.
Yeah.
Barack Obama popularized that semantic shift, because worship, that's in your mind.
But you have to get there first.
Yes. Yeah, but religion is really a public sort of thing. It's private and it's public.
Yeah.
It affects your whole life. It's not just what happens on Sunday mornings. Michael, if you suggest that God has something to do with your political view, why, that makes you a theocrat. Now, what does that even mean? I don't even know what that possibly means. It shows you this error that unfortunately too many squishes have fallen into. They believe that secular liberalism, an idea that has existed at the mainstream level for 40, 50 years, that is a neutral playing ground. That somehow we all just play. There's nothing neutral about it. It's untrue, right? It is not the case that God does not exist. It is entirely in the progressive leftists' direction, and we will never win as long as we accept that. So you have to begin with God. There is no question about that. Cardinal Manning very famously said, all human conflict ultimately is theological. Even if you want to take St. Andrew Breitbart's famous maxim that politics is down from culture, which is true, though it's been overstated, because I think it's been taken as an excuse by politicians who don't want to recognize that politics affects culture too, and they actually have to do something when we elect them. But let's assume that's true. Let's not forget culture and cult come from the same root word.
That's right.
Right? There is, if we are talking about things that are downstream, all of this is downstream of religion. And so we need to establish a few things that are true. Getting back to William F. Buckley Jr., he used a very ridiculous phrase one time, but nevertheless, it's a true phrase. He said he was an epistemological optimist. It's a classic Buckley phrase, the $20 words. He means that he believes that some things are true, they're knowable. He said, I do not want there to be a more open society. Society is quite open enough. I actually want some things to be closed. I think we've settled certain things, and I see no reason to defend the liberty of a Nazi or a communist. So we can know things. We actually can. This would shock the sensibilities of many conservatives today, but it was the conservative belief until very, very recently. And I think we need to recover some sense of that confidence and that courage if we are to do anything whatsoever. If we can remember that courage is the prerequisite of the other virtues, we might too remember that there are virtues, that virtues are better than vice. This is true in public life as well as in private life. And that, as John Adams famously said, our Constitution is built for a moral and religious people. It is not fit for the governance of any other people.
Yeah, that's right. That's very well said. Courage is basically the theme of the hour. Yep. I think more than anything, we're seeing that. We were just in front of a huge crowd of Southern Baptists gathered here in Nashville. That's where we are. But gosh, that was basically the call to action: is you got to be courageous, you got to stand boldly, and you got to go do. And so we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining this podcast. Thank you for writing this book. And for all you mean, as you're a teacher in so many ways, and this is oftentimes a classroom we learn so much from you. Really appreciate it.
The pleasure is all mine. It's so nice to, having written a blank book called Reasons to Vote for Democrats, it's nice to have a book with words called Speechless, and it's such a pleasure to speak with you about the book with words.
Awesome. It's perfect. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.